Hi again. We're back for session number 6, one more time looking at styles. As you may recall, last time we looked at the fundamentals of understanding the different styles, which means that today we will be focusing on the interrelationships between the styles. To do this, we're going to start with a couple of distinctions that we skipped on the grid from last time, namely creation and preservation and thought versus action in the middle of the page. At the bottom of your notes page, we have 3 sets of quadrants drawn out for you, just like the 2 on the screen here, and we would like for you to use these for the next couple of minutes. On the first map, please draw a diagonal line from the upper left down to the bottom right, and between control and influence write down creational, and below that offense. Between power and authority, please write down preservational, and below that defense. Here's our claim. In any sport, certain people are better at offense while others are better at defense. Well, we claim that business is like sports, and some people are better at starting things and other people are better at finishing things. Controls and influences are your more offensive players, while powers and authorities are more your defensive players. To be clear, this is not a question of competence, this is a question of what's more natural. It is more natural for controls and influences to start things from nothing, while for powers and authorities, they like to take things that are started and get them through to the finish line. As you look at this distinction, you may be thinking, well then, controls and influences probably get along because they're both on the offensive side, as do powers and authorities who are on the defensive side together. However, we have found this not to be the case, and the next distinction may tell us why. On the second map you have here, this time draw a diagonal line from the upper right down to the bottom left. Between authority and control, write down thought, and between influence and power, write down action. Again, here's the claim. When you find people under stress, they will typically default to either wanting to think first, then act, or act first, then think. It's not that one is better than the other. Obviously, we could use both thought and action. The key is to understand where you and others are coming from, especially when pressure hits. So then, controls and authorities are your think first, then act types, while influences and powers are your act first, then think types. Again, neither is worse than the other, just different approaches. So for a minute then, let's take stock of what all of this means. Let's add up the propensities of each style according to these 2 distinctions, which will show us the main differences in perspective between all of the players. First, control. Controls are offensive, meaning that they like to start more than they like to finish, and they are thought-oriented. When you add these attributes up, controls are all about the vision for the future. If you think about it, that's what an idea is, something creational in thought, and controls are all about the ideas. Next, let's look at influence. See, influences are offensive just like controls, but they are very much action-oriented over thought-oriented. When you add up these attributes, it means that influences are all about velocity or speed. Let's go, ready, fire, aim. Remember? Next, let's look at powers. Powers are defensive, so they like to get everything finished more than they like to start things from nothing, and they are action-oriented. This means that powers are all about delivering value. They want to get into a productive routine that produces tangible results and puts points on the board. And finally, authority. Authorities are defensive like powers, but they are more thought-oriented like controls. So when you add up these attributes, authorities are really all about quality and standards. Let me see what you have started so I can review it and make it better. That's an authority's dream sentence. So again, these distinctions are on your grid, but we believe that these in particular are easier to understand on our maps. And when you think about these 2 maps as topographical, as all of our maps are, you can quickly see the unique perspectives we all bring to the game of business. On the final map that you have at the bottom of your page there, yep, don't worry, we weren't going to forget about it, we now want to discuss the styles that are naturally complementary. For a minute, think about the question to yourself. Which 2 pair of styles might be a good and a more natural fit together, in business and oftentimes in life? Can you see it? Think about an adage you've heard a million times in your life. Opposites attract. That means controls and powers often do well with each other, while influences and authorities do too. And if you think about it, in each pair you have one offensive and one defensive style, as well as one thought-oriented and one action-oriented style. Pretty interesting to consider, right? Now this doesn't mean that all styles can't do well with each other. These are just the more natural complementary styles, meaning many times it's easier for them to strike up and create a relationship. Well, the other thing this might be doing for you is bringing into question then, what are the propensities anytime you have a cross-axis relationship? Good question. And that's where we want to focus, because these relationships, while entirely possible of course, typically take a bit more energy to create and preserve. With that said, let's look at each one in a bit more detail, starting with control and influence. The most common breakdown between control and influence from the control perspective is that controls feel as though they cannot trust influence. Controls are thought-oriented, competence-based, focused on the ideas, and have a natural 5-year perspective. Influences, meanwhile, are prone to change direction in the moment and start doing new projects before they are fully strategized out. In short, this approach drives controls crazy when unobserved and will lead to controls many times hunting influences out of their organizations. On the other side of the coin, influences commonly feel as though controls try too hard to micromanage them. Remember, influences have a survival conversation of, if I have to do what other people tell me to do, I will die. Controls like to dictate. This combination can make influences feel as though they need to break out of control prison. On the upside, when and if these two styles can learn to work together, they can make an incredible team. We do say if, though, because this is typically the most volatile of all the cross-axis relationships. But assuming they do learn to respect each other's perspective, the upside is this. The influence lets the control person help provide a little bit of direction, while the control learns to let up on exactly how influence gets from A to B. Together they can make a great offense, because in terms of driving new projects and new business, they will get more started with better strategy than either one working alone. Turning our attention now to influence and power, the most common downside to this cross-axis relationship for influence is that they look at the structure that powers want to put in place and again see that structure as a version of prison. Influences like their flexibility, powers like their routine and order, and this makes them a volatile combination if they're not careful. Not surprisingly then, powers will often look at influences and see pure chaos, and then think to themselves, I cannot let that guy anywhere near my process. So even though both are action-oriented, one, influence, is creational and likes to start a bunch of new things, while the other, power, is more regimented and wants to get everything that's started completed. When you look for the potential of upside for these two styles, there is a ton. Typically how it looks. Influence is the initiator of a project or a lead, and then once the project or lead is warmed up, power takes over to make sure that everything is followed through on. It's a great handoff when these two learn to see where the other is coming from. Next up, power and authority. Here you are dealing with the two preservational styles, but their differences can actually cause serious breakdowns if they're not careful. How it typically looks is that power is so focused on quantity that they forsake quality, leading to errors and an appearance of incompetence. On the other hand, authorities get so focused on quality at every turn that their commitment to perfection becomes the enemy of good, and they can't get anything out of the door. The typical result then is that powers will tend to avoid authorities. Oh no, here comes that guy who's going to stop the action and critique everything I'm doing. All this does is encourage the authorities to go find the powers, creating almost literally a game of cat and mouse throughout an office. What a waste of time and energy. Moving on to the upside between power and authority, and there can be a ton of upside, this occurs when powers learn to go to authorities a bit earlier in the process of delivery in order to get some input and advice on things like prioritization, while the authorities learn to ease off a bit and allow powers some latitude to work, knowing that they will get a final look before the deliverables go to the market. This combination of thought and action orientation, when brought to the process of follow-through for a team, is an unbeatable combination, really. That's why we call a functioning power and authority duo a great defense. The final cross-axis relationship to discuss is between authority and control. Here you find certain similarities. For example, both are thought-oriented and both are competence-based. However, the major difference is operational time frame, and it is a big difference. For controls, they look out into the future and see how a new idea could be the perfect thing to pursue. Meanwhile, to authorities, they are constantly looking for evidence to see why something should be pursued. Then, due to their common thought orientation, these two styles can fight, like lawyers, for a long period of time. As for upside, it can be there if these two styles are willing to give a bit each direction. Typically, the best setup is when authorities provide options to controls based on research into the past. Controls then review these options and factor a bit of analysis into their decision-making to determine which direction we should go. In such an instance, both styles are able to play to their strengths. So that ends the cross-axis discussion. Remember, we are not saying that such relationships are impossible, only that they are typically a bit more difficult to create. If you have one already, then we would claim you have an advantage. Let's turn our attention now to what we call the struggle principle. What this means is that typically each style struggles the most to act or to deal with the style clockwise direction from their own. We'll show you more in a minute, but for now, please write this down. The biggest barrier to your prosperity is your inability to move clockwise direction on the maps. Okay, let's dig a little deeper. Starting with control, the struggle principle states that this style is least comfortable acting like or dealing with influences. Why? Well, what influences do naturally is focus on others. Controls focus on ideas, and often believe their ideas are so good they shouldn't have to persuade or convince others, so they just don't. This can lead them to either churning through the people around them in their lives and or avoiding having any influences around who might be naturally good at creating relationships. Next, influences are typically least comfortable with powers. Why? Again, because powers do naturally what influences cannot, which is follow through. So while influences love to get things started, they can be assessed as flaky by others because they often break their promises. The result? Influences want to fly by the seat of their pants and go without much of a structure at all. Next, powers are typically the least comfortable with the authority style. Hopefully you are now tracking with the principle. It's because authorities do naturally what powers do not, which in this case is review and reflect in order to see what's working and what's not working. Powers don't typically like to do that type of reflection because it could lead to exclusion of people or projects, and powers don't like for anything or anyone to be excluded. And finally, authorities typically are the least comfortable with the control style. The control style is all about making declarations about the future, which requires decisions to be made, which is not something authorities like to do without a ton of reflection. So oftentimes around authorities, you see age-old traditions being followed, even if they're a bit antiquated. So again, please keep this a priori struggle principle in mind. We do find that learning to either move a bit outside your comfort zone, either through acting like the style that is clockwise direction from your own, or through coordinating action a bit more with another person who is of that style, that such actions can help accelerate your prosperity. The flip side to the struggle principle is a priori's second most principle. In other words, which style is the second most comfortable one from your own. The principle states, and again, please write this down, the style counterclockwise is typically each style's second most comfortable style to their own. Let's take a look in a bit more detail, beginning again with control. For controls, their second most comfortable style is typically authority. Here's why. Controls operate for the sake of the idea. Once they hatch an idea, typically they struggle to want to have to persuade others to like the idea. That feels like a waste of time, meaning that they don't really want to build relationships and sell others on the idea. So instead, they would rather travel counterclockwise towards the authority style, get all of the evidence for why their idea is right, then cram it down other people's throats for their own good. This, of course, is the ultimate dictate survival strategy that we discussed a couple of meetings ago. Looking next at influences typically find that their second most comfortable style is control. Here's why. Influences are creational and action-oriented. They like to get things started. Once initiated, they struggle with putting structures in place for follow-through. That feels like a race to boredom. And that work and replication actually looks like prison. So instead of risking any loss of flexibility, influences begin to travel counterclockwise towards control and figure that they will just come up with another new idea, move to a new town, change their name, and start over. This is the ultimate form of a migration pattern for influences. Turning our attention to powers typically find that their second most comfortable style is influence. Here's why. Powers love to focus on production. They are preservational and action-oriented, meaning they like routines and cranking out a large volume of output. They typically struggle with review and reflection, feeling as though it is a waste of valuable work time, and would rather avoid confrontation and looking at evidence in case that leads to somebody being excluded. So instead of facing certain issues head-on, powers will often move counterclockwise towards influence, make an effort to redress the relationship so that they can get back to work. This is best summed up with the following funny quip. If you send a power to fire someone, they oftentimes will end up giving that person a raise. This approach is why we claim that powers use a tolerate survival strategy and sometimes get taken advantage of by others if they're not careful. Finally now, let's look at authority. Authorities typically find the power style to be their second most comfortable style. Here's why. Authorities love to keep their options open. They are reflective and introspective people more often than not. So asking an authority person to focus the control direction for new ideas and declarations about creating a brand new future is typically like trying to push rope. Instead, authorities would rather go into an existing structure and focus on short-run have-tos as a way to avoid making any decisions about the future, a form of avoidance behavior. This is the ultimate hibernation strategy and is why so many authorities are said to have analysis paralysis. So there you have it, the a priori second most principle. This is a good way to understand your natural habits in business and can give you insight into the habits of others out on the field. Let's move now to what happens when each style meets up with someone of the exact same style. The results are actually different in all four cases. Starting with control, what happens when you get two controls in the same interaction? Well, you have two people with a 5-year plan, presumably convinced that they alone have the best idea, and who may struggle when others question whether they have the right strategy. Further, you have two people who want to be in the director's chair. So it may not surprise you that most often when two controls meet, there is friction, and we call it a right fight over who has the best idea. What about an influence and an influence? What do you think happens here? Well, here we have two people with a similar ultimate concern for freedom, and both are creational and action-oriented. Further, influences love challenges and will sacrifice everything to be free. So when you add all of that up, what do you get? A lot of fun, but nothing gets done, which is the definition of a party. So unlike two controls, influences will get along, but that alone does not mean they will get anything productive accomplished. Next, let's talk about two powers. What do you think happens here? This time you have two people meeting up who are task-oriented, focused on to-dos, that love to replicate, and that would prefer to get into a structured mode of operation. Further, powers are typically the most tolerant style of the four, mostly because they want to get things built. So again, what do all of these attributes bring to mind if two powers were to meet? What about a factory? So if controls struggle the most with their own style, powers typically struggle the least. Not only can they get along, something influences can do too, but they also tend to focus on producing results. That leaves an authority with an authority. What would we get here? Well, we would have two people that most naturally want to focus on trends and evidence from the past, and then review that evidence to figure out what to do going forward. This propensity to analyze and administrate might lead them to do what together? If the image of a committee came to mind, we claim you would be spot on. Authorities won't have the friction necessarily of two controls, or the chumminess of two influences or powers, but they will look at details. The problem, of course, can be that sometimes no decisions are ever made when things are kept in committee too long. So as you look at the results here, suffice it to say that even when you meet with your own style, there can be certain issues if you're not aware. So there you go, a comprehensive look at styles over the last 2 meetings. Now, just one more thing to do. How about a quick quiz? For fun, then we'll wrap it up. First question. What would each style say if we brought in a glass of water, filled it up about 50% of the way full, put it on the table, and asked each style what they saw? What would an authority person say? Half full? Nope. How about why? Think about it. Authorities don't like to make decisions without all of the information under the sun, so they would probably want to know why they were being asked. What about a control person? What would they say? Yeah, the director nickname would really apply here, and they would say, "Hey, fill that up for me." Typically, controls are the most demanding styles on others. What about a power person? Well, power is kind of the opposite of control, so they might come right out and ask, "Would you want me to fill up that glass for you?" That's why we say a waiter. They would want to do some work and be included. Finally, what about an influence person? This is the toughest one to guess, mostly because it is tough to predict where an influence person might go. And that is the point. Now we claim they might say something like, "Hey, where's my cheeseburger?" Something from outside the box. That's the point. Next, what if we walked in on each style napping at work and snapped them out of their nap? What would be the first thing they would say? What would be their reflex? Well, the control person would probably say, "I know, I wasn't sleeping." They don't want to look incompetent. A power person? What about what do we have to do? They're ready to build. Influence? Maybe something like, "Let's go," action-oriented, ready to start moving. And finally, the authority person? How about "I object"? They'll start from the no, but the no is only a maybe. Now that we have everyone awake, what if we put all 4 styles on a bus and asked each one to tell us what they were focused on when they were looking out the window? Well, the control person would probably focus on the big picture, the horizon. The power person, he would look at the reflection, of course, to see what everyone else is doing. The influence person, he would be thinking, "How can I get out of here? Can I easily break this glass? Don't fence me in." And finally, the authority person, well, he would be wondering when that window was cleaned. And so, there we go. The entire point of the discussion on styles in 3 fun quiz questions. We are not all watching the same movie. The sooner we understand ourselves and others, the sooner we can take things a little less personally and begin executing with more efficiency and effectiveness with our colleagues, clients, friends, and family members, wherever you choose to apply this styles approach. And with that, we're done. Except, of course, for your practice assignments. Please make sure to get those into business the day before the next application meeting. We'll look forward to it. Thank you very much, and now get back in the game.